Did you know that between the 1930s and 1960s, Algeria was the biggest wine exporter in the world? The most commonly grown grapes at the time in Algeria were Cinsault, Carignan, Grenache, and a little bit of Alicante Bouschet. Between the 1830s and 1960s, Algeria was a French colony, and so much of that wine was exported to France and then blended with French wines, not least of all during the mid-19th century when phylloxera absolutely devastated the French national vineyard. We know that during this time, a lot of Carignan Cinsault blends were exported to France labeled as Burgundy, even though we're pretty sure there were never any meaningful Pinot Noir plantings in Algeria. By the 1930s, Algeria accounted for over 70% of the world's wine exports. By the 1950s, they'd already joined the European Economic Community in order to access more markets for export. And even in the 60s, when they went through a successful war for independence and another military coup after that, the Algerian wine industry still seemed really rather solid. By 1968, they were not only the fourth biggest producer of wine in the world, but they were still the world's largest exporter. Meanwhile, on the other end of the continent, way down south, a humble farmer was planting a very small Chenin Blanc vineyard. Now we fast forward to today, the Algerian wine industry has all but disappeared. There has been time for an entire world-conquering wine industry to be completely obliterated. And yet, if we go down to the South African Swartland, we will find that very same little 1968 vineyard still in the ground, still producing fruit and delivering some rather special wines. Not least of all, today's hand drink solo wine of the day, which is the Fledge and Co. Au Bostock or Old Bush Vine Chenin Blanc 2022, which was vinified by the winemaking team of Margaux and Leon Coetzee. Members of the Hand Drink Solo Club will no doubt recognize the daring duo of Margaux and Leon. Leon is kind of like Jason Statham in The Transporter. He spends a lot of time on the road checking in on various vineyards all over the place and making sure that that fruit is harvested well and transported safely back to the cellar. In the lead up to any particular harvest, he does as many as 20,000 kilometers going from vineyard to vineyard across the rather widely spread South African winelands. Leon has to do all of this in order to make sure that the fruit can make its way back to Calitzdorp, where Margaux then does her magic in the cellar. So I guess if Leon is Jason Statham, then Margaux is Bryan Cranston? We know that this vineyard was planted in 1968, and it was in the Malmesbury ward of the Swartland, just to the west of the town of Malmesbury on the way to Darling. The record says that it is a 100% Chenin Blanc vineyard, but at a point in history, there was a dark pall of doubt cast across this assertion. There were whispers, nay, rumors, muttered from behind withered stumps and between curling leaves and the dying light of autumn eves. Perhaps, at some stage, not all of these vines were Chenin Blanc. Some could have been Clairette Blanche, others still perhaps Palomino, and others still possibly Colombard. Now, as far as I'm concerned, and I think winemaker Leon Coetzee agrees with me, rather than detracting from this wine, I think it adds to the rich history and legacy of the wine because it reveals to us these little nuances and practices in the history of South African wine, which does show a little bit of a Wild West frontier attitude to what many people believe to be a rather staid, unchanging tradition within the wine world. I can see how this doubt may make some purists grumpy, but to those purists who get grumpy at the thought that perhaps a 100% Chenin Blanc is not 100% Chenin, I would suggest you don't look too closely at the technical specs of the supposedly legendary pinotages coming out of South Africa in the 1950s and 1960s. Anyway, on paper, the vineyard is 100% Chenin Blanc, and when we get into the glass, I think you'll see it does deliver a fairly classic rendition of the grape. When we give this guy a sniff, well, we do get a lot of those classic Chenin Blanc elements. There are sweet peach fruit elements, quite vibrant and really articulate. You've got some slightly tartar apricot notes. And then there's also a touch of lovely citrus, but it's not overly ripe. And it gets a little crazier too, because there's some tropical elements of perhaps dried mango and guava fruit roll. And in case you thought that didn't sound pretty enough, on top of all those elements, there's also fairly explosive sort of lemon blossom burst that really is quite lovely. To sum it up, the nose is really rather primary. That is to say, most of the notes come from the fruit, the grape, Chenin Blanc itself, as opposed to coming from lees or from an oak barrel. When we take a sip, we do get plenty of that delightful primary fruit, loads of stone fruit, peaches and apricot all over the place. But there's a sort of extra layer of intrigue that we get that we didn't necessarily smell on the aromas. Because in amidst all those primary fruit elements, there's also a touch of spice as well. Perhaps a little bit of white pepper, and then almost kind of like a citrus essential oils, a kind of sense of heat that comes from not the pith per se, but the actual essential oils in the skin of a lemon, if you perhaps chew on some lemon rind for a while. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, well then go chew on some lemon and get back to me. And then working with that combination of really primary fruit and a very gentle touch of spice, we've got quite a nice level of concentration on the palate. So these subtle non-fruit elements really roughs up the otherwise almost convent level purity of the fruit on this wine. And it adds a little more intrigue, a little more mystery. It's kind of like when you realize that the nun who taught you divinity happens to have a Rolling Stone tattoo on her butt cheek. So that's all we have time for today. But if you have any questions about old vines or Malmesbury or Chenin Blanc or the South African Wine and Spirits Board, then leave a comment on the website and I will make sure to get back to you. And if you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon so that we can make more videos like this, and subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos each month talking about things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars that are coming out of the dynamic South African winelands.